So I want to introduce Dr. Nikki Sheets. He's the director of the Center for Urban Environment of the John Watson Institute for Urban Policy and Research at Kean University. Dr. Sheets was a founding member of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, and he's been part of many other state and federal environmental justice committees and councils. Among the issues he works with are on air pollution, climate change, cumulative impacts, developing EJ legal strategies, and increasing the working capacity of the environmental justice community. Welcome, Dr. Sheets.
You know, I don't dress up too much. I've been trying to keep my collar down the whole time. And a lot of times on Zoom, I won't show my face sometimes, and I'll tell folks, I know you can't see me. Oh, so I'll say, I know you can't see me, so just imagine Denzel, and I look just like Denzel, and I guess that won't work here, because you can actually see me. All right. So let's see. Let's see if we can work this. All right, it works. All right. So, Dr. Halkidis gave a good, everybody, thank you, Mitch, for the introduction. But Dr. Halkidis talked about going to the core of the problem, and so we're going to talk about that today. Here's an outline for my presentation, and we're, Kendra, I'm watching the clock too, Kendra, wherever Kendra is. So we'll do some EJ 101, EJ for environmental justice, give you some background on EJ, and then we'll talk about two prioritized policy areas. And what I want you to take away from this is, I want you, from the EJ background, I want you to take away some basic information about the EJ grassroots movement, but also about our relationship. And in this case, and just start, you think about this, and all of a sudden you don't think about something relevant until you're sitting there and your presentation's already done. The sector I want you to know about with respect to our relationship that I'll concentrate on a little bit is with the environmental organizations. And that's probably appropriate because we work with them, sometimes against them a lot in policy. I'll mention, though, to some degree, the relationship between universities and the EJ movement. So I want you to take away a little bit about those relationships. And from the cumulative impacts, one of our prioritized policy areas, I want you to know that we have one of the strongest cumulative impacts in EJ laws in the country now, and it's also generating other laws. And for the climate change mitigation policy, I want you to know about the controversy or debate we're having, at least from an EJ perspective, about climate change mitigation policy and EJ. And I don't think a lot of people outside of the EJ community and environmental community and probably policymakers, that kind of people that pay attention to it more in details actually know that this debate is going on. So let's start. And hopefully I'm supposed to talk for 45 minutes. If you fall asleep, that's cool, just don't snore. And I'm fine with it. Hopefully you won't fall asleep though. And I want to start off by saying, the only thing I really want to tell you about me is that I want full transparency. I want you to know that I'm part of the EJ grassroots movement. So I'm not neutral. And one of my main functions within the EJ movement is to try to help the EJ movement develop the best possible public policy from an EJ perspective. And I'm also a member of several EJ groups, my home organizations, the New Jersey EJ Alliance. So I try to help those groups, coalitions, build capacity in many cases. We'll talk more about this, keep them in existence. Although now under our new leadership and great staff, we're actually flourishing more than we did before. Environmental justice. We often say we're at the intersection of the civil rights and environmental movements. We had our first director, our statewide director of the New Jersey EJ Alliance used to always tell me, Nikki, we're at the intersection of the Black Power movement and environmental movements. But that's a whole other discussion we're going to save for another day. But we generally consider it the intersection of those movements, and we, EJ Grassroots Movement, oftentimes bring the color into the discussion about environmental issues. By that I mean the people. Most of us are people of color in the EJ movement, but we're well integrated. We also have white folks, because remember, EJ is about communities of color and low-income communities of any color. And here's a kind of reductionist view of what EJ is. We're worried about the disproportionate amount of pollution you often find in communities of color, low-income communities. We want to make sure that people living in these communities take part in the decisions that impact their communities. And we want to make sure these communities also sharing the benefits produced by improving the physical environment. And why I say this is kind of a reductionism view of EJ, because now EJ covers a wide variety of things, right? You hear about food justice, transportation justice, climate justice. Well, for us, all of that is encompassed in EJ. Although I would still argue maybe it's because what we do the most in EJA, that still the core is reducing pollution burdens, and I'll explain why in a minute. So, the EJ Grassroots Movement, I've talked about it a little bit already. Mostly people of color, but well integrated. Usually smaller organizations, right? As opposed to the environmental movement. When you normally think of the environmental movement, you think of large, white-led organizations. Now, there are many small environmental organizations, though. Don't want to say there aren't. But generally, when we refer to we say the mainstream environmental movements, we're talking about, you know, multi-million-dollar budgeted organizations like the Natural Resource Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, Greenpeace, Earth Justice. You can continue naming them, National Wildlife Federation. Besides the distinction about who we are, right, people of color, people representing low-income communities, as opposed to mostly white folks in the environmental organization, there's also been, and still is, a great disparity in resources. So of the funding that goes to environmental issues, less than 5% of it goes to EJ organizations. And this drives us absolutely up one wall and down the other. Most of the money that goes to EJ issues does not go to EJ organizations. Most of it is actually going to mainstream environmental groups. Now that's starting to change. We're starting to get more resources. And I bet Melissa, the executive director of NJEJA, will probably say more about that. She's heavily involved in that, and part of our success story in getting that, part of the reason we have a success story. Of course, we wonder how long that's going to last, though. What's directly relevant, all this is directly relevant, but what's directly relevant to the policy stuff I'm going to talk about today, policy positions, is that we have different core missions. Right? The core mission of the EJ movement is to protect communities. Now, we worry about the physical environment, and we want to protect the physical environment, but our core concern is protecting communities. The environmental movement, on the other hand, traditionally, their core concern has been improving physical environments. Now, they worry about communities, but traditionally, and this is changing somewhat, their core concern has been about improving the physical environment. And because we have those different core missions, we're sometimes driven to different policy points. And you'll see one of those today in climate change mitigation policy. You'll hear about one of those today. I've been at this about 20 years now. And one of our great successes has been, well, I always say, we have managed to move EJ from the margins to the mainstream of environmental policymaking discussions. And now we're trying to get significant policy victories. And EJ now has become more mainstream, and we've worked for that for years. But we've gotten to the point, you hear I say but, and we've gotten to the point where everybody and their mom and dad want to do EJ. And that's a success story for us, because we have people calling us now that wouldn't call us before. We have congressional staff calling us. And they wouldn't call us before. We'd have to chase them down. And we have, you know, Hopefully more resources are coming in now. Maybe that'll be maintained. So it's a good thing, but it can also be one of those things about be careful what you ask for, because it also represents a threat. Because now we have institutions like the environmental groups, like universities, like government, and we want to impact government because they make decisions, but moving into the EJ space. And what does that mean for smaller EJ organizations when you have a larger institution, Rutgers University maybe, right, moving into the EJ space and has more resources, better name value, and frankly, more white folks, right? So we are in danger, we the environmental justice movement, of being marginalized in our own space. Because who are you going to listen to if Rutgers comes up with an EJ policy, or the New Jersey EJ Alliance comes up with an EJ policy? Who's the wider society more likely to listen to? Now, look, just like I'm saying, just like I'm doing now, we haven't been hesitant to call this out in the EJ movement. And what we've asked of these institutions is to on EJ issues, let the EJ movement lead. Okay, with that background and that context, let's start talking some policy. A little policy wonkish, but I think it'll be interesting. And let me say, the talk is not, what I'm going to talk about, obviously I'm not centering on, I know I have a public health crowd here, right? Got to play to the audience. But I'm not centering on the relationship between public health and EJ, but I'll make those explicit connections as we go along. Because EJ is really, I said protecting communities, right? It's really about public health more than anything else, about the health of these communities. So let's start by talking about cumulative impacts. And this is arguably the premier EJ issue in the country and has been for a while. Here you have a formal definition of cumulative impacts, cumulative impact, a formal definition that we've been using in New Jersey, or the New Jersey EJ community has been using. And cumulative impacts are the risk and impacts caused by multiple pollutants, the risk and impacts caused by them both individually and when they interact with when they interact with each other and with social vulnerabilities that exist in neighborhoods. And remember what neighborhoods we're talking about. Right? We're talking about communities of color and low-income communities. And it's really been difficult to address cumulative impacts for a couple of reasons. And what we have often said is that addressing cumulative impacts in the context of issuing pollution permits has been the holy grail of the EJ movement, and you see we're starting to make advancements in that. So why has it been really difficult to address cumulative impacts? A couple of reasons. How our country approaches pollution, trying to address pollution, is setting individual standards for each pollutant, right? We go pollutant by pollutant, we set a standard. And the problem with that is that if those individual standards are not violated, oftentimes, usually what government will say to us, to EJ communities, is we can't do anything for you. So, typical EJ problem. Let's take a real case. Hess wants to build a power plant in Newark, which already has more than its fair share of polluting facilities. And the community in Newark, and Newark is what, 88% of color, so Newark is an EJ community, right? Says to government, no, we already have, all these polluting facilities. You're going to put one more in Newark? And what does government say? Both New Jersey DEP and EPA. They say, well, we don't think any individual standards are being violated, so we really can't do anything for you. We're going to go ahead and the conversations about whether an air pollution permit should be issued. So we're going to go ahead and issue the air pollution permit. And the community comes back and says, well, wait a minute though, but you're not taking into account that all this stuff is coming into our lungs and mixing, right? You like to say, you don't have any compartments in your lungs. The particulate matter doesn't go in one compartment and the nitrogen dioxide in another compartment and the sulfur dioxide in another compartment. They come in and they mix together. And community says, surely that's happening even if your individual standards not being violated. That ain't good. That's not good. It's having a detrimental impact on us. What happened? Well, the permit was issued. So that's one huge issue about cumulative impacts. The another is, because there are other issues besides the two I'm going to talk about, is a relationship, Dr. Al-Qadis called this out, between race, income, and pollution in our society. So here are two figures that I've become infamous or famous for showing. I want to apologize already to my colleagues that are here that have seen this before, to Melissa and Candace. And we have Carrie Butch, who actually works for Rutgers and is on the board of NJEJA. And in the back, we have Chris Tandazzo and Cynthia Hall, Dr. Cynthia Hall. They've seen this before. Apologies, they have to see it again, but I like having a new crowd to show it to. The figures were created by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection in 2009, and the first thing they did was they assigned a cumulative impact score to every neighborhood in New Jersey. And in this context, you can think of cumulative impacts as a very rough estimate of the amount of pollution in a neighborhood. And in order to figure out what the relationship is between cumulative impacts, the amount of pollution in the neighborhood, and race and income, they graphed it. And you see, depending on how I feel, and what I call the unfortunate results, the unholy results, I'll just let you look at it today. Look at the top figure, and you'll see what's happening as the number of people of color living in a New Jersey neighborhood increases. So is the estimate of cumulative impacts, right? Same thing is true for the number of people living in poverty. As the number of people living in poverty in a New Jersey neighborhood increases, so is the estimate of the amount of pollution. So I'll say what I've said before, a lot of different audiences. What this is providing evidence of is that if you live in New Jersey, the amount of pollution in your neighborhood is connected to race and income, the amount of money in your pocket, the color of your skin, and that goes against everything that our state and country at least claim that they stand for. And now let me say a couple more things. This is not unique to New Jersey. If other states did similar studies, many of them probably have similar findings. And in fact, one of the things that started the EJ movement was that several national studies were done. They did have similar findings in the late 1980s. And here's where the explicit relationship comes to public health. Why we're really worried about this is that we think, scientists think, everybody pretty much thinks, that the disproportionate amount of pollution you see in EJ communities, and EJ communities are on your right? Here's Newark over here, 88% of color. The disproportionate pollution load that you see in the communities are connected to the persistent health disparities that we have in our country that are rooted in race and income. And that's the crux of it, why we need to do something about it. All right. Let me say something new that maybe my colleagues haven't heard. I used to say this, and I don't know why I stopped, but I just came from an EJ conference in the Southeast, and a really impressive guy named, young man named Nathaniel Smith, who's the executive director of the Partnership for Southern Equity. And this is an EJ crowd now. And he reminded us that environmental injustices, in part, are a legacy of slavery. And not only a legacy of slavery, but after slavery, you had, and I just want to remind this audience and be patient with me because I haven't said this for a while, so I'm trying to say it correctly. I just want to remind this audience that we were a slave country longer than we were, and I won't say a free country, than we were a country without slavery. And then after slavery, you had government-sanctioned racism, which I will argue didn't end until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And then, of course, after that, up until today, you have ongoing racism. Right? In this case, we're talking about environmental racism. So the disproportionate pollution loads that you see there that are connected to race are partly a result of the legacy of slavery, the legacy of government-sanctioned racism, and the product of ongoing racism. It's been going on too long. It's going on until right now, to today. And it needs to stop. It's unacceptable, it needs to stop. Both the racism and the classism. And to that end, the New Jersey EJ Alliance and some partners have developed cumulative impacts policies. So one is a statewide cumulative impacts policy. Another is a municipal level policy. I'm going to talk about statewide cumulative impacts policy now. The municipal level policy was adopted by Newark in 2016. The statewide policy is going through some transformations, and I would argue is part of why we see what I'm going to talk about, the cumulative impacts law now, and with the regulations that are going to come out. I'm sure Candace is going to say this is going to come out publicly. They may be out soon. So here's a history of cumulative impacts in New Jersey from a grassroots perspective. You see, we've been working on this problem for a while. You see, the first New Jersey EJ Alliance committee that was formed was back in 2007. I bet Carrie was on that committee. We can't remember now. We're both getting old. She's younger than I am, though. But back 2007, 2008, I did a deep dive in my computer for this, by the way, so I think it's pretty accurate. And you'll see that the first statewide law that was developed on this by Senator Weinberg, by the way, the senior woman legislator in the state, was 2012. And, you know, she developed that without talking to us. She had to get the idea from us because no one else was talking about cumulative impacts at the time, but, you know, the EJ community and some allies. And we supported it, but it didn't go too far. Then in 2017, Senator Booker, our senator from New Jersey, came to the EJ community in New Jersey and with an EJ bill on the national level now. But it didn't have cumulative impacts in it. So we said, well, if you're going to do an national EJ bill, you need to have cumulative impacts in it. And we gave him our statewide, we gave his staff, right? I don't talk to the senator. We gave his staff our statewide cumulative impacts policy. And to their credit, they ran it by legislative council. They incorporated it into the bill. Now, they incorporated a slightly different version of it into the bill. And they submitted the bill, and the bill says, and it was the first bill that I know of, well, certainly the first national bill. The first law in New Jersey said it also, but it's the first national bill, and maybe the second bill of any kind, that said, based on cumulative impacts in EJ, under certain circumstances, you should turn down applications for pollution permits. We knew it wasn't going to go anywhere. The president was President Trump at the time, but we thought it was important to do to keep the conversation about EJ going on a national level, and so we organized national calls into this bill. I can't even tell you how many. We organized calls all from EJ communities all over the country into the bill, and we thought it would keep the discussion going, and we thought on the state level something might happen, and that's what happened in New Jersey. Senator Singleton from South Jersey, who's a hero of ours now, massaged the first bill from 2012 and reintroduced it. Right? Came up with another cumulative impacts in EJ bill. And we worked with him, that was 2018, we worked with him on that bill, and it was finally adopted in 2020. And the regulations are going to come out any minute now, publicly. And the reason why the bill is so important is that it was the first legislation in the country that was adopted that said you should actually turn down applications for pollution permits based on cumulative impacts and environmental justice. And here are the guts of the bill. Right, the bill starts out by defining an overburdened community. It says any census block group that is at least 40% of color, or, and that's important, it's or, not and, or 35% low income, or whose residents, or where at least 40% of the residents are of limited English proficiency, they are defined as an overburdened community. Now, in the EJ movement, we would call these EJ communities because you notice there's no environmental indicator involved in defining them. But to be honest with you, we were so happy that someone was talking about cumulative impacts bill in this way, we let that go. We shouldn't have, we should have said, wait a minute. But the substance of the bill was so good, we were like, okay, we can handle that. So then the law says that if you're going to seek a major pollution permit in one of these communities in New Jersey, and these are census block groups, by the way, smaller geographic unit than a census tract. You have to do an EJ analysis. And if that EJ analysis shows that by granting the permit application, environmental and health stressors in the block group that will host the facility will be higher than in other block groups in New Jersey, if you're asking for a new pollution permit and it's going to make those stressors higher, then that permit shall be denied. If you're asking for a permit that's for renewal or that will expand the facility, even if granting the permit will make those stressors higher, the permit can't be denied, but conditions can be placed on those permits to limit the amount of pollution that that facility will emit. And here you have the exact wording of what the EJ analysis would involve, or the standard is using. If granting a permit would cause or contribute to adverse cumulative environmental and public health stressors in the overburdened community, in the EJ community, that are higher than those borne by other communities within the state, county, or other geographic unit, then what I said, right? Denial for new permits, conditions for other permits. So what environmental and public health stressors? Well, we have a preview, although we haven't actually read the regulations coming out. We, participated in the process to have these regulations developed. And my slide, so you see some examples, right? Actual pollution, fine particulate matter, talk a little bit more about that. Actual disease risk, the number of polluted sites, traffic, right? And so there are, and I think I have this wrong, I have 31, I think there are 28 now that will come out in the regulations. Important aspects of the law that were, I shouldn't say we fought over, that we discussed intensely was whether it should be may be denied or shall be denied, and it shall be denied. Whether the law should address renewals, and initially it did not, but then that was added in. The federal law, by the way, addresses renewals and says that due to cumulative impacts, they should be denied also, along with new permits. Compelling public interest exception. There is an exception that I won't talk about a lot today, but we argued it should be tightly controlled. So when I say exception, I mean that even if the facility would cause stress to be higher, for some facilities, and what we're hoping is that this will be really limited to, what we suggested was that it should be really limited to public waterworks. and nothing else should fall under the exception. But we've argued strenuously that exception should be very small. And industry came in and argued from the beginning, and then came in after the end of the comment period for the regulations and argued there should be an economic exception. In other words, they should go to communities and say that if we're giving you jobs, you should take the pollution. And we went a little crazy because we thought that would undermine the law entirely. We thought it was bribery. We thought it was extorting communities, saying that we will only give these communities what other communities have if you accept pollution that will kill you and make you sick. Fundamentally unfair. And so, to DEP's credit, that is not in the regulations. So the regulations, the key to the regulations, the key thing or in my opinion, they will delineate is how you do the EJ analysis. Right? And that's kind of the ball game, right? How is that analysis going to be done? And so the regulations, because remember, this is new now. Right? New law, new concept. People all over the country are watching us. In fact, I forgot to tell Candace I want to extend an invitation to WEJAC to you and Sean Moriarty to come talk about it. And, again, this has been and will continue to be precedent setting. But as important as we think this law is, holy grail of the EJ movement, right, we understand that it's not a silver bullet. We understand that one law is not going to address all the cumulative impacts, all of the disproportionate pollution load that are in EJ communities. There are going to have to be other laws along with it, right? There's going to have to be a suite of laws. What we have come to say is that we're going to need cumulative policies to address cumulative impacts. And that leads us to our next topic. Let me do a time check. That leads us to our next topic, climate change mitigation policy. All right. I don't hear any snoring yet. Everybody's being polite. Good. Because I want to make another argument to you about this slide now. You see the disproportionate pollution loads depicted to the right of the screen. So I want to argue to you that there are at least two types of policies that we need to develop and implement to address the disproportionate pollution loads. One type I've talked about already, that you address cumulative impacts through the concept of cumulative impacts. Right? That's what the New Jersey law does. It does a cumulative impact analysis, if you will, and says if you have higher level of cumulative impacts because you're going to grant a permit in the host community, then you're not going to get the permit if you're asking for a new permit. Right? But another type of law that I think we're going to need are laws that address the different kinds of pollution that go into making up the disproportionate pollution load. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. One of those types, one type of pollution that goes into making up that load. I should say one thing. Oh, okay, I'll hold off. So let's talk about climate change mitigation policy. So I should have included a slide. I do, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I should have included a slide that said climate change mitigation policy. I think most people know what it is. Usually I'm talking to environmental crowds, but I think public health crowds now probably know this as well as environmental crowds. To fight climate change, what do we want to do? We typically want to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, right? And typically, that is carbon dioxide. Well, from an EJ perspective, and here's a basic premise, what we also want from climate change mitigation policy is we want to reduce emissions reductions in EJ communities. And so look at the top bullet. Here's the essence, here's a more detailed premise of what we want from climate change mitigation policy from an EJ perspective. We want guaranteed emissions reductions in and near EJ communities, preferably with greenhouse coal pollutant reductions intentionally maximize, but reductions either way. So what the heck does that mean? Okay, let's go through it clause by clause. And this is the ball game. I could stop talking about this then. I won't, because I like to talk, but this is really the essence of the presentation about climate change mitigation policy. So we say guaranteed emissions reductions in and near EJ communities. Well, you know what an EJ community is now, right? Community of color, low income, community with low income. So why am I talking about guaranteed emissions reductions here? Because isn't climate change mitigation all about emissions reductions? Yes, but not necessarily everywhere. And I'll expound on that in a minute. So we want these reductions in EJ communities. Second clause, preferably with greenhouse gas co-pollutant reductions intentionally maximized. Okay, you know what a greenhouse gas is, right? That's the stuff that's causing climate change. Usually we're talking about carbon dioxide. And I should say, we are talking about the power sector here, the electricity producing sector. So we're talking about power plants. And we still have to get to other sectors and extend this. We call this mandatory emissions reductions. And it's gained traction in New Jersey and around the country also with other EJ groups, and to some extent in government now also, because we're talking about the power sector specifically here. So power plants not only emit greenhouse gases, they also emit other pollutants along with the greenhouse gases. And those other pollutants in the parlance of climate change mitigation policy are called greenhouse gas co-pollutants. Now, there's a distinction between the carbon dioxide and these other, and the co-pollutants though. Recall that greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide are thought to be a global pollutant. And by that, scientists mean it doesn't matter where you reduce it. So reducing carbon dioxide in California is the same as reducing it in New Jersey. That's a theory anyway. And recall that greenhouse gases don't harm you directly, at least not in the ambient atmosphere, right? How they're harming you is by causing climate change, and climate change harms you. But the co-pollutants do harm you directly, and they harm local communities near the power plants. Right? And the co-pollutants are contributing to the disproportionate pollution loads in EJ communities. So what we're saying with our policy is that, look, we're down with the fight against climate change, because climate change is hitting our communities first and worst, but we also want to use climate change mitigation policy to reduce the disproportionate pollution load in EJ communities because it's contributing to that load. So we want to get more bang for our buck. And ideally, we would design climate change mitigation policy so that you would intentionally maximize the co-pollutant reduction while you're hitting a carbon dioxide reduction goal. If you want to reduce carbon dioxide by 10%, you get policies that hit that goal, but maximize the amount of co-pollutant reduction. But there's no policy that we know of that does that, climate change mitigation policy. So we say we'll take the next best thing and guarantee us emissions reductions of carbon dioxide from these power plants in our communities, and we'll take the incidental reduction that we get in the co-pollutants, because there's a correlation between the carbon dioxide emissions and the emissions of the co-pollutants. The most important co-pollutant we talk about is fine particulate matter, also called PM 2.5, small enough particles. Unfortunately, you're breathing them in now. Here's your public health connection, right? Unfortunately, you're breathing them in now, and they cause death and destruction, particularly in EJ communities and communities of low income, because concentrations tend to be higher. Right? So that's what we're after. We want to reduce these co-pollutants. And one thing you should know is that what the science is telling us, and we were just reading this because EPA is proposing to change. There's a national standard for the amount of PM 2.5 that can be in the air, and they're proposing to change that. And they had in their proposal that PM 2.5 has disproportionate impacts on, you guessed it, people of color and people with low income. And what the science is saying also is that there's no lower threshold below which if you keep lowering the concentration of PM 2.5, you won't get positive health benefits. I'll say that in English. The lower the concentration of PM 2.5 in the air, the better. So we want to combine what's being done now on these coal pollutants with climate change mitigation policy. We want to put them together, and in that way, we think we can drive down concentrations of these pollutants. We can drive them down to levels that the government has not been able to attain thus far, just using the strategies they're using right now. Right? We want to add climate change mitigation policy on top of this. So if you're a power plant located in EJ community, you got to reduce your emissions if you're under a climate change mitigation policy. That's the idea. Here's something on the coal pollutants. Look at the top about fine particulate matter. I should update my citations. But look, in 2013, MIT came out with a study that said just fine particulate matter caused 200,000 premature deaths in the United States. And again, disproportionate impacts on EJ communities. So climate change mitigation policy gives us an opportunity not only to fight climate change, but to also address EJ. And if we don't take that opportunity now, right, because there is some, despite what maybe a third of the country believes, there is some political will around implementing climate change mitigation policy. So we want to use that will to also help EJ communities. If climate change mitigation policy was used in the way that we are suggesting, it would make it immediately relevant to communities that thus far have been largely left out of the discussion on climate change. Because the minute you rolled out climate change mitigation policies, you would start saving lives everywhere, but particularly in communities of color and low-income communities. You wouldn't have to wait for the next climate change event, right? Severe storm, heat wave, to make climate change mitigation policy start saving lives. And I'm not belittling, I can't say that right, you know what I mean, right? I'm not belittling the impact of climate change, because we know in New Jersey from Sandy how bad those impacts can be. But climate change mitigation policy would immediately help these communities if used in this way. Here I did cite some investigations that show that air pollution disproportionately impacts EJ communities. And I'll say the figures I showed you are a little dated, they're 2009, but you see the first citations there, 2021, 2019, are studies that also have similar results, that air pollution is disproportionately impacting EJ communities. So what's the problem from an EJ perspective? This seems like a fairly straightforward idea, right? If you're going to make power plants reduce emissions, take the extra step and make those power plants located in EJ communities, force them to reduce emissions. The problem is the most prevalent policy that we're now using to fight climate change, which is carbon trading. Right? New Jersey is in a carbon trading system called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI for short. And under carbon trading, you're not guaranteed emissions reductions from all plants at all locations. Right? The way carbon trading works is that you set an overall emissions reduction goal, say it's 10%, and then all the power plants that are under that policy, if they collectively meet that goal, then that's all right. If the power plant in Newark doesn't meet the goal, but the other power plants make up for it and you meet the goal, under carbon trading, that's all right. Under EJ, that's not all right, because you want the power plant in Newark and near Trenton and near Camden to reduce emissions because they are adding to the disproportionate pollution load in EJ communities. And so in a way, under carbon trading or under this climate change mitigation policy, which may be, think of it at large, EJ policy, environmental policy at large, may be the most important environmental policy we develop to fight climate change, and we're using a policy that doesn't guarantee emissions reductions, pollution reductions in the communities that have the most pollution. It's leaving equity decisions, as I've defined it here, up to the market. Now, let me be careful here. I'm not saying that under carbon trading, EJ communities will not experience reductions. Right? 3 things can happen in EJ communities under carbon trading. Emissions can go up, worst case scenario. Emissions can stay the same, still not good. We want reductions. We can get reductions. Undoubtedly, under carbon trading, you will get some reductions in some EJ communities. But the question under carbon trading will always be how many EJ communities will get reductions, right? Which EJ communities will get reductions, what will be the extent of those reductions, and over what time period will they occur? That's too many questions from an EJ perspective. Let me step back and give you a picture overall what we're talking about. What I'm arguing to you is that EJ and equity should be incorporated in any climate change mitigation policy up front. And what's happening now a lot of times is we develop the climate change mitigation policy, and then we say we'll get to equity and EJ later. They should be done at the same time, and no climate change mitigation policy should be developed without an EJ and equity component. And where emissions reductions occur should not be left up to the markets. Markets should not be making equity decisions for us. Those decisions should be intentional, they should be planned, they should be made by policymakers and communities. New Jersey EJ Alliance has a mandatory emission reduction policy. We're reconstituting it now under the leadership of, you'll hear from Melissa shortly, who suggested, look, our policy needs to have more community input from it. And I can go over the community input. We developed it as an air pollution policy because communities were coming to us about air pollution. But let's get more input directly about the policy. Let's go to of-color social justice organizations, which we've done actually already, that don't necessarily focus on EJ. Let's have a statewide committee on this. And we're also going to have to look, we're changing the policy I presented a little bit. We're looking at it again because a couple of issues have popped up: carbon capture and sequestration and hydrogen, that we have to take that into account in the policy. Okay, so this is it. Usually I end the presentation by challenging folks, and I'll do that. I'll make that challenge. A lot of institutions, universities, environmental groups, policymakers say that EJ and equity are priorities. So at the end of the talk about climate change mitigation policy, I'll say, okay, if that's true, here's a challenge: then obtaining emissions reductions for EJ communities of the co-pollutants as important as obtaining carbon dioxide reductions. And think about what that means. It would mean just what I said. You can't do climate change mitigation policy without EJ and equity. I'm going to do something extra. That's a challenge. You all have been challenged to do that now. But I'm also going to deputize you and make you ambassadors of EJ. So you thought you'd come and listen to our talks and there would be no price. This is the price of listening to our talks. You all are going to be in spaces where we are not. Right? And here's what I mean by an ambassador. What we want you to do is that when you're in those spaces and the EJ community is not in the room, and they're talking about the issues that we've talked about today: cumulative impacts, disproportionate pollution burdens, climate change mitigation policy, and they don't mention EJ, you've got to mention it. Now, you've got to raise your hand and say, all this is cool, but where's the EJ and equity? You don't have to be mean about it. You don't have to be particularly aggressive about it, but you got to say it. If you accept the challenge I just gave you, making co-pollutant reductions as important as carbon dioxide reductions, if you act as ambassadors for the EJ community. I love this picture. You saw it earlier. There's a little girl from the EJ community. You'll make her much happier than she's looking there. Thank you.